Welcome, everybody, to this first session of Think Tent, put together by my own Institute of Economic Affairs and our friends at the Taxpayers Alliance for your delectation, education and delight over the next couple of days. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General of the IEA, at least for a few days longer, a little while longer. And my job is to simply chair proceedings on this topic, and we're opening with a very big topic: how to drive economic growth. The Conservatives have selected as their slogan for this conference, long-term decisions for a brighter future. Have I got that right? I think it's something like that, isn't it? I'm going to be asking our panel whether we've actually failed to take long-term decisions for quite a while, and we have a star-studded panel to guide us through this thorny topic. And before I introduce them, just a few numbers to sort of conjure with. Long-term growth rates in the Western world have been typically below 2% for 30 years. Very limited growth here in the United Kingdom. And we have seen, at least going alongside that, higher taxes here in the UK, heavier regulation, and a bigger role for the state. Not suggesting that those are inextricably linked, but they might be. We also seem to be running into a problem of we can't fund everything we would like to fund. We've been running budget deficits now since 2001, no end in sight for actually balancing the books in any given year, let alone tackling the national debt. Perhaps means of getting GDP growth up off the floor from its rather poor 1.5% that we've been experiencing since the financial crash is the way to actually start to balance our finances, bring prosperity, and if not solve all of the various economic and social problems we've got, at least to mitigate them. Let me just tell you how the format's going to work. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to give their 5-minute analysis of how they would bring about greater economic growth. I'm going to then ask them one or two questions, and then we'll go over to the floor for your comments. So let me introduce our star-studded panel in the order in which they'll speak. On my immediate left is Liam Halligan, British economist, journalist, author, broadcaster. He's, of course, presently the economics and business editor at GB News. He also writes in the Telegraph and presents, I hope all of you listen to it, the absolutely brilliant weekly podcast Planet Normal. I'm sure he's going to be very normal in what he's going to tell us today. Speaking second on my far right is Ted Bromund, Senior Research Fellow, Anglo-American Relations at the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom. He's been a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Centre for some time, previously served 9 years as Associate Director of International Security Studies at Yale University and writes widely for a wide range of publications and is going to give us, I hope, the US perspective. On my immediate right is Aria Babu, have I got the pronunciation right? I did check that with you earlier, who's worked in technology policy for several years and is a policy fellow at the Startup Coalition and an advisor at the Entrepreneurs Network, where she was previously head of policy. To my left is Kate Andrews, the economics editor of The Spectator, regular star in the national media, writes a weekly column also for the Daily Telegraph, former associate director and comms director at the IEA, as well as having been head of comms for the Adam Smith Institute. And on my far left is Matthew Elliott, president of the recently established Jobs Foundation. He's worked in UK public policy for almost a quarter of a century, has overseen 2 national referendum campaigns, both successful, 4 high-profile pressure groups, all successful, and has convened 2 respective policy commissions, both very successful so far. Please give a very warm welcome to our panel. Liam, I'm going to start with you. What's the magic formula here? And it's become a big debate now, economic growth, right? Only in the last year or two, really, but the numbers are pitiful. Why, and what do we do about it?
Well, Mark, I'm an economist, which means I'm an expert who doesn't know what he's talking about. But I'm going to make you feel as if that's your fault. Here's another quote. In the long term, productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything. Now, some people say that was Milton Friedman. Some people say it was Alan Greenspan. I don't really mind because I think it's true. And if annual productivity growth between 2007, since the financial crisis, and 2019, it was 0.2%. Had it been 2%, which it was in the UK for the previous 30 years before the global financial crisis, the average UK worker would be £5,000 a year better off in real terms. It would be completely transformative. Why is growth so low? Quick list. I'll just touch on some ideas. We can do more in the Q&A. Tax. It's now approaching 38% of GDP, of course. The state is huge. Borrowing is massive. Do you know that borrowing during the 5 months to August was 40% higher than during the same period the previous year? Did you know that debt interest is now £110 billion a year? It's now 10% of all government revenue. It's now the second biggest line on the national accounts after the NHS. Absolutely astonishing. So we need to get tax down. We've got the longest tax code in the world. It's 20,000 pages. Hong Kong's is just 300 pages. It's 5 times longer than the combined collection of Harry Potter books, and it's grown threefold since Gordon Brown took office in 1997. So what would I do? I'd lift the starting rate of income tax to 20 grand from 12.5. I'd raise the corporation tax threshold from 0 to 100k, take millions of SMEs out of tax, and I'd increase the high rate threshold from 50 to 70 and have a 40% flat rate above that. That's the first thing I'd do. The second thing I'd do is house building. Every single recovery from recession in the last 100 years in this country has been associated with a big boom in house building. That's every single recovery from recession, apart from the recession of 2009-10. And we had the most vapid, unconvincing recovery from recession we've ever had. That's not a coincidence. The problem is planning, but it's not just planning, because there are a million planning permissions outstanding that the big builders don't use. They get the permissions, they sit on them, they don't let the small guys near them, the small guys who build quickly to aid cash flow. Our house building industry is oligopolistic at best, possibly a cartel in localized areas, though they would deny it. Though at the agitation of some of us, the CMA is now investigating exactly that question. So house building is absolutely crucial. Infrastructure, not HS2, but better links into and between our northern cities. HS3, Trans-Pennine route, Liverpool, all the way through Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, York, Newcastle, Middlesbrough, linking together our great northern cities. It can be done for hundreds of millions rather than hundreds of billions, and you get a much better bang for your buck for doing it, and it should start now. Skills, the perennial, T-levels haven't really taken off. We still fetishize university. It's still seen as not good form if your kid's going to become a plumber. I tell you what, I'd encourage my kids to become plumbers at the moment. They earn a lot more than journalists. And they earn a lot more than many management consultants as well.
Talk a lot more sense as well.
And finally, and they know how to charge. My final point, Mark, because uncharacteristically I'm going to be on time, is sound money. Why have we grown so little since 2007? Why has the global economy and our economy not really got out of second gear since 2007? There are many reasons, but I think a big reason is the massive expansion of central bank balance sheets. I think it's led to a big misallocation of resources, malinvestment. I think it's really spooked a lot of business leaders, and they've kept money off the table for that reason. So I think we need to, while returning to reasonable rates of tax, proper infrastructure planning, promoting skills, I think we need to return to more traditional central banking. We should state as the government that we're never going to do QE again, because it has been massively damaging. It's undermined our currency. It's also been a huge driver of wealth inequality by pushing up house prices beyond where ordinary families can secure a decent place to live. So that's my recipe for growth.
Liam, thank you very much indeed. 4 pretty easy things to kick us off with. I hope to hear them in the Prime Minister's speech on Wednesday.
I'll put them
up. Ted, the floor is yours. Your 5 minutes start now.
Thanks very much, Mark. You've tasked me with the job of presenting the American perspective. I feel myself entirely capable of speaking for a nation of 330 million people. So let's get started. We all know that the U.S. press, especially the New York Times, really likes to attack the U.K., But the headlines over the last few months in the U.S. have really been alarming. Let me just read a few of them to you. Associated Press, economic outlook worsens as high prices plague consumer spending. Wall Street Journal, economic rut gets deeper. CNBC, only major European economy to contract this year. Economist, builders on the brink of collapse. Euro News, went from the envy of the world to the worst performing major developed economy. Bloomberg, weak PMI data suggest economy facing contraction. These are the kind of headlines we get in the United States, and it's pretty sobering stuff, I think you'll agree. Except I've left out one thing. All those stories were about Germany, not the United Kingdom. And that's really my takeaway. British financial, monetary, and economic policy have really been terrible since at least 2003. There have been too many errors to go into. I agree with a lot of Liam's implicit diagnosis and his recommendation. I'd summarize it above all as saying that British policy has emphasized trying to expand demand artificially, above all through QE, while not focusing much at all on supply side reforms. If you pile lots of demand artificially into the system while not increasing supply, you get inflation, you get shortages, you get zombie firms, you get strikes, and you get slow growth. In other words, you get the United Kingdom today. But my point is that none of this is particularly British. The errors of economic policy that Britain made from 1945 to 1980, especially in the first 2 decades, were mostly unique to the United Kingdom. This time around, it's different. The errors that Britain has made have been the errors that everyone else has made. Everyone QE'd. Everyone locked down. Everyone has subsidized demand. Everyone has expanded regulation. Free trade is at a discount everywhere, and everyone is taking more in taxes. So yeah, Britain has had a poor growth record for a long time, but that's also true of most of Europe. The U.S. has done a little better on growth. We do tend to do a little better on growth. But our record on growth and a lot of other areas, inflation, shortages, etc., have been broadly similar to the United Kingdom's and Europe's. Now, in this context, you hear a lot of clamor about rejoining the EU or realigning with the EU. Not a surprise. Of course that's what they want to do. EU reentry is about as relevant to Britain's problems today as the man in the moon is. In fact, talking about reentry is part of the problem because it arises from the same political and intellectual class that's produced in the UK, in Europe, and in the United States the failed policies of the last 20 years. It's more of the same. It's for this reason that I think that it's going to be very challenging for Britain, the US, and indeed for Europe to address these problems because they arise from the shared policy views of an intellectual, social, and cultural elite that is more homogeneous and more internationally homogeneous than it ever has been in the past. It is very difficult in this environment to get challenging new ideas implemented in policy. The conservative governments of 2010 to 2023, by and large, did not implement those policies. A future Labor government certainly will not do so either. The only major challenging policy that Britain has adopted since 2010 was Brexit. And Brexit was preeminently the result of an extra-parliamentary agitation. I have enormous admiration for the work that Mark, that Matthew, and that John O'Connell have done in their various organizations over the last few years. And I think in their various ways, they really show the way forward. It is increasingly unlikely in this kind of environment that the solution is going to be found through regular political parties working in the normal way. Brexit happened because of extra parliamentary agitation that forced the Conservative Party to take the idea of a referendum seriously, really for the first time in its history. And that, I think, is going to be the answer going forward. Britain needs, and the U.S. and Europe needs, new ideas of the sort that Liam has put forward today. They're not going to happen unless people take up the kind of crusading zeal that was embodied in the campaign that produced Brexit, but this time for much broader economic aims that can and will restore growth to the United Kingdom.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. And good job, both Liam and Ted, for sticking so brilliantly to time. Aria, your 5 minutes and strict 5 minutes start now.
Okay. So over the past few years, the UK's economic growth statistics have seen pretty dire. I want to compare us to America because I think a lot of British people kind of assume that we're like about as wealthy as America. Like, sure, their salaries are higher and their GDP statistics are higher, but we have, the NHS and lower crime, and maybe that basically pays for it. I want to say that the US is 39% richer than we are, and that since the financial crisis, despite already being wealthier than us, their economic growth has been, on average, about double ours. We have now, in terms of GDP per capita, been overtaken by Slovenia and South Korea, and in 12 years, we are due to be poorer than Poland. I think even countries that look like on a GDP per capita level are poorer than us, in many important ways are probably richer. Take France. France's GDP per capita is slightly lower than ours, but French housing is cheaper, French transport is cheaper, French childcare is cheaper, French energy is cheaper. So realistically, a French person, despite maybe having in sort of like dollar amounts less money than us, they are probably wealthier than we are. This, I think, leads us instinctively to feel quite pessimistic. But actually, I think the fact that our problems are so obvious means that they are much more fixable. In America, they're talking about, the rate of scientific progress is slowing down. How do we make our economy more innovative? There are really difficult questions about like trying to make science work better and to make it easier to create really innovative companies. But we're so much further behind them, and actually our problems are very simple and self-inflicted, that it probably is fixable. So I have like 3 ideas for things that we could do that would make us much wealthier overnight. Housing. So American housing is about half the cost of ours per square foot. If you look at business rents as well, in Birmingham, a square foot of office space is more expensive than it is in central Manhattan. Per square foot. The only thing that we have to do to fix this is to build. This is a complicated political problem, but it's not a difficult economic problem. There are loads and loads of possible policy solutions to make it easier to build. We could liberalize the Greenbelt rules. We could implement street votes. We could do estate regeneration. We could build loads of social housing and then sell it off afterwards. There are so many possible ways that we could solve this problem, and estimates for what this would do to economic growth number from about 3 to 30%. I don't know which of those numbers you think is plausible, but it's going to make a massive difference to the country. The next is energy. We have to build more energy. American energy is 3 times cheaper than ours, or more accurate, I guess ours is 3 times more expensive. Again, there are loads of things we could do. We could do onshore wind, we could do offshore wind, we could do solar panels, we could do nuclear reactors, we could frack. There are loads and loads of things we could do to deliver more energy, and whichever solution that whatever party in government would like to do, that would make us much richer. The next is that we have probably the most punishing business investment tax regime in the world. Well, out of the OECD countries, we're 35th out of 36. Again, that's quite simple. Sunak brought in full expensing, but only temporarily. If we can make that permanent, that would immediately take us over into one of the better off countries for business investment. Basically, our problems are fixable, and with enough political will, we will be able to turn it around. And the fact that house prices are so high that, is actually, in some ways, a positive sign. It means there's a lot of energy in the British economy. It means that we are incredibly innovative. We are still a global hub for AI and fintech, despite having all of these self-inflicted problems. Loads of people still want to move to this country. So yeah, I think our problems are fixable.
Aria, thanks very much indeed.
Well done.
Everybody's stuck to time. Come on, Kate and Matthew, you're going to filibuster a bit, aren't you? Kate, the floor's yours.
I'm not as optimistic as the panel has been so far, so I will keep my remarks short as to not depress everybody. But there's an irony that every political party wants to at least pay lip service now to economic growth in a way that I don't think they did until about a year ago. And yet they've decided to do this at a time where we cannot take a punt. And by take a punt, I mean spend money and see how it goes, because there's no money left. And the opportunity to borrow has come and gone. Those artificially low interest rates are no longer here. As Liam pointed out, we are spending roughly the same as we are to service our debt as we do on the entire education budget this year. We don't get any new schools or any new teachers for that. We are paying for money we've already spent. And another irony is that schools are literally falling apart right now. So I think that speaks to the short-termism over the past 13 years. But interest rates aren't on the floor anymore. They've risen significantly. And it is very disappointing that rather than investing a tenth of the cost of HS2 in local infrastructure, they decided to go for these grandstanding projects that are very likely never going to really come good, and even if they do, they'll be many years out of date. Rishi Sunak could have been on the BBC this morning announcing huge success in local infrastructure projects that have come online, that are up and running this morning. Instead, he was fielding questions and dodging questions about the future of HS2. So a lot of missed opportunities there. But I think Liam and Aria have done a great job of laying out areas where we could see economic growth. Rather than repeat them, I'll just add a few more. You can't really meaningfully increase growth if your population is chronically ill. We've had 500,000 additional people join long-term sickness for out-of-work benefits since the pandemic, taking that number to 2.5 million. It's only rising with the NHS waitlist in the state it's in. That number doubles, more than doubles, to 5.3 million for the number of people on out-of-work benefits at record highs since the pandemic. So we have to get people back into work. And I would also point to immigration. I think the system as it sits now is actually quite good. I think that it is a genuine post-Brexit immigration system, but I think these attacks on the headline number without breaking down who those people are, the vast majority are coming here to fill jobs that we desperately need filled. If those people have their way, that will be a real hindrance. But let me tell you why I'm not so positive that all this growth is going to happen. Because I think for free marketeers, we spent a long time saying, look, there are three ways to do all the things we want to do. You can if you want to find money for things, you can raise tax. We don't like that so much. You can cut public spending. I think a lot of it should go, but it's very politically tricky. Or you can grow the size of the economy. And the idea was always, if you can grow the size of the pie, then that number of 37% of tax receipts equal 37% of GDP now. Government spending more, it's around 40%. That number shrinks as you grow the size of the economy. The problem is twofold. We have two departments, the Department of Health and the Department of Work and Pensions. Within that, you've got welfare benefits, but you also have pensions. Between them, they account for 40% of public spending. And that number is only rising. There is a reason that the Office for Budget Responsibility, regardless of your feelings about that body at the moment, I think is quite right to point out that our trajectory, so long as we don't reform the NHS and we don't reform pensions, is truly unsustainable. By the time you get to 2070, you are looking at a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 300%. Now look, the optimists in the room will say lots of innovation will come in that time, we'll have lots of advancements. Sure, I agree with that. But ultimately, it's pointing out that our current system is simply not fit for purpose. And my concern is even if you do get, say, 2.53% growth, something robust, taking in all the reforms that Liam and Aria have laid out, you are still in a situation where your public spending trajectory is so catastrophically large that you are not going to feel all that much richer. You are not going to feel all that much better until politicians can really tackle the health service and really tackle pensions. The two issues that I would say they have absolutely no interest in talking about because they are far too politically scary. And that's where the pressure has to come, because until we address those things, we can grow the size of the economy even meaningfully, and it will continue to be eaten up by certain departments.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. And to round us off on introductory remarks, Matthew, your 5 minutes start now.
Thank you, Mark. I want to spend a bit of time talking about the B word. And this isn't Brexit, which Ted rightly talked a little bit about.
Burnley?
Or borrowing, which Liam talked about, which is another important issue. But of course, business. Because really the question here is, in a sense, not so much how do you drive economic growth, but how do you make the UK more business friendly? And I think we've been moving in the wrong direction on that front for far too long. So if you think about it, without business, you don't get the economic growth that we need. Without business, you don't have the jobs which we all need. And if you look at the jobs market, about 3 in 4 jobs are in the private sector. Of course, they're all generated by businesses. But even the 1 in 4, the quarter of jobs in the public sector, they wouldn't be there without the tax receipts generated by business. And of course, without business, you wouldn't have all the tax revenue for the public sector. So really, the heart of all of this is really how do you make the UK more business friendly? And we've heard from the other speakers some of the ways in which the UK has become less business friendly. But this has been in terms of rhetoric. I think that if you think back sort of 2 prime ministers, to Boris Johnson talking about F business, he might have been talking about the business groups, but for what most people heard, that was just a blanket thing, F business, and that went down extremely badly. But even in more recently, I spent a little bit last year listening to the CPI conference when it was still going. And I heard Rishi Sunak's speech there and Keir Starmer's speech to them, and neither of them, when they spoke to the CPI, really talked about the benefits of business and what business contributes to the UK. Now, that's astounding. If they were speaking to the National Farmers Union, they'd be talking about how brilliant farmers were and how we wouldn't have food on the table without farmers. But they weren't out there extolling the virtues of business. So really, for me, I think to get economic growth going, yes, ditto to all the policies mentioned above, but really at the heart of policy making, every policy which the government thinks about needs to be analysed through the prism of, is it good or bad for business? That's at the heart of how we'll drive economic growth. Thank you.
Yeah, all on time, as Liam says. If only the government could budget as efficiently as our panel. Thanks for those early ideas. As I say, I'm going to ask our panellists a couple of questions. I also want to ban something. Kate, I nearly hit the red buzzer there. We've surely got to stop talking about growing the pie, right? Every time Liz Truss
It's a
says
cake.
this, you don't grow a cake either. You bake a pie. You don't grow a pie. You grow a plant. I don't think normal human beings understand the growing the pie analogy. But what I want to ask each of our panellists, because they put a whole range of ideas and also in Kate's case a couple of warnings on the table. I just am bamboozled that politicians haven't grasped this. The IEA is not involved in electoral politics, we're involved in ideas. But I would have thought if I was an electoral politician, one of my aims, if I was in government, would be to ensure that people felt a lot richer when I was seeking re-election than when I was first elected. I thought this was the route to proven success, indeed, electorally. I think, wasn't it Ronnie Reagan in 1984 who basically ran on the slogan of, do you feel richer than 4 years ago, and won a complete landslide. So what genuinely confuses me, and I'll go around the panel in which the order they spoke is, why aren't politicians grasping this? Okay, we all say, well, reforming the planning system is all a bit difficult, talking about pensions all a bit difficult, or, the OBR might veto our moves on corporation tax. But it seems to me that the economic prospects of the country are joined at the hip with an incumbent government likely to be re-elected. And growth, okay, well, actually, I will give the panel, if you want to compare growth to a pie, that's fine, but it seems to me most of our politicians treat growth like an act of God, entirely exogenous to what policies they bring about, and if it's sort of looking a bit weak, that's because of Ukraine or COVID or the weather or God knows what else. Why isn't this the magic electoral formula, that if you had 2 or 3% growth per year, presumably you would have vast parts of the electorate saying, I'm feeling much better off, actually, I can afford another holiday. I'm not having to count the pennies at the end of the week. So I just find it strange that the economics here, we've all said, are simple, but it seems to me, with only a tiny dash of courage, the politics should be simple as well. Liam?
Yeah, after Ronald Reagan, of course, it was Bill Clinton's strategist James Carville said it's the economy, stupid. It was a kind of it was a bullet point for democratic activists bashing phones, but it became rightly a sort of celebrated phrase in US and indeed global politics. It is about the economy. I thought the GDP per capita figures that Aria produced about our relative standing in the world are really very, very shocking. I think growth has become a dirty word, and it's become a dirty word because I think a lot of the coverage of politics, and particularly the economy, is dominated by people who are pretty well off. Our media isn't representative anymore of the country it's trying to cover, it's trying to serve. It's a serious point, and something I've experienced throughout my so-called career, that most people who try and cover economics, present company accepted, that they're from very well-heeled families. They don't give a shit about growth because they're fine. And growth just means more building, and growth means dirt and muck and brass, and growth means, you know, not being able to virtue signal on the environment all the time. We've got to rediscover the virtues of economic growth. We've got to start promoting economic growth because I think the political class has dissed it. And you know, we can't talk about this without going back to events of a year ago. And obviously, Liz Truss is going to be speaking at the Growth Commission rally tomorrow, which I'm delighted to be chairing on her behalf, and the other senior Conservative figures who will be there on the platform. And you know, a situation's emerged where what happened last year, which happened for all kinds of reasons, partly bad messaging, partly bad presentation, partly because the Bank of England started selling bonds into the market 2 days before the mini budget, which is something you don't hear on the broadcast news, but it doesn't mean it's not true. There are many reasons why that happened, but we can't allow that to totally discredit the case for economic growth, and that is what's happening. The media it's become shorthand for, oh my God, we can't have economic growth because that's libertarian and mad and neoliberal. No, economic growth is the reason that this city is known around the world. Economic growth is a very virtuous thing, and so people like us have to not be ashamed to promote the virtues of growth, because growth is people's jobs, people's prosperities, people's dreams and hopes. It's a very natural human state to want to advance ourselves and a lot of not just ourselves but also our families. If you diss growth, you are going against human nature, and it really is as elemental as that.
Ted, what are your thoughts? Why isn't this, you know, a popular electoral proposition?
Well,
I'll
I'll answer you with an analogy. The case for free trade is, as far as I'm concerned, irrefutable. Right? Does anyone in the audience, would anyone on the panel like to challenge the ideas of Adam Smith, of Cobden, of Bright, at least two of these gentlemen, great liberal thinkers and liberal activists? But yet, free trade tends not to be very popular with voters. Why is this? Because, as has been observed a million times, the benefits of free trade are distributed. Everyone gets a little bit. But the people who are hurt by it are hurt individually, and they're hurt a fair amount. And there are losers as well as winners. And losers complain very loudly when their ox is gored, but people who are just a few p or a couple pounds richer, doesn't matter much to them. The same thing is true of growth. There are lots of things in the UK and the US and Europe that hold back growth. There is planning, there is QE, there is the unreformed NHS. There are lots of things. Each one individually is probably not so terrible. Collectively, they are an enormous burden. Each one commands a significant interest group, and the amount of gain that you would get economically from reforming any one of them is not enough to overcome the inertia presented by that block. So I think the political logic is really very simple. Everyone benefits from growth, but everyone really complains when their individual ox is gored. And unfortunately, the system is now so complicated, so full of special interests, that it is very difficult to find reforms that will make enough of a difference without goring a lot of oxes.
Aria.
Yeah, I agree. I blame the voters.
No compromise with the electorate. That should be our...
Exactly. So I think I disagree with Liam in that I think whenever you talk to people who I would consider to be political elite, so like I have friends who work for both like the Sunak administration and maybe the future like Starmer one, and they're constantly thinking about how they can increase economic growth, except for the fact that they have to deal with newspapers and polling and the goddamn electorate. And part of that is because of what you've said about how, like, sometimes when people are punished slightly for adding a couple of pennies to other people's, like, paychecks, that's a problem. Some of it is because, lots of people don't have like a good understanding of what economic growth is. It's like an abstract principle, and that's part of the reason why when you're lobbying for something, you'll usually try and say the numbers in terms of numbers of jobs, because that feels more tangible. But like growth is like a little bit abstract and not very interesting. And part of it is because a whole bunch of our electorate's like life outcomes are completely basically divorced from economic growth. In the last election, I believe the median age of a voter was 55. Which means a whole bunch of them are going to retire quite soon, and their pensions are basically divorced from economic growth because they go up with either inflation or wages, or like 2%, depending on whichever is higher. Similarly, we've got a whole bunch of people who are in education or long-term unemployed, which basically means that only about half the British public are working, if you put all these numbers together. And so they don't care that much if the economy grows. So, yeah, I blame that.
Blimey, Kate, you were the one who said you were going to give us the pessimistic news in your opening remarks. This all sounds pretty grim, and I wonder whether I can ask Kate and then Matthew to pick up on some of these points. Are these barriers therefore insuperable? Liam mentions a particular kind of segment of the media class, but we've also had, say, environmental campaigners, making a virtue of zero growth or below, that actually we should be aspiring to seeing our GDP fall. Is your initial pessimism right, Kate? And do you want to double down on it, given what you've just heard from the other panellists?
Well, yes, they're challenging me for the biggest pessimist. Those voices are certainly out there, the degrowth voices. Personally, I don't think they really have the traction with your average voter, with your average person. I think there is a broad understanding that we desperately are in need of some economic growth. People understand a decade's worth of stagnant wages. People understand the hit of inflation. They want to be richer. They want things to go in the right direction. I think it would be giving those voices far too much credit to say that they're fundamentally the problem. I think the answer to your original question, Mark, is in your question. It's the word politics. Right? It is what is politically feasible is very, very different sometimes than what we know will actually be good for the country. And let's go backwards here. I mean, I think Rishi Sunak is right to note that getting inflation down is the number one priority. The irony, of course, is that he has very little control over that. That is in the remit of the Bank of England. So to take credit for it is a risky game indeed. But he was right to say that inflation is a tax. I think he's correct about that. Let's go backwards. Liz Truss. She had a very pro-growth rhetoric, and the policies did not match that rhetoric. She brought in an energy price guarantee that in her own growth plan was estimated to be the single biggest handout in British history. Didn't end up being that expensive, but that's what she estimated. That's what she was asking the markets to borrow. And she did that for political reasons. The reasoning was, well, I'll just deal with this, and then nobody will come back to me on this, and I can get on with my agenda. In fact, it exploded her entire mini-budget. Boris Johnson, biggest opportunity waste, an 80-seat majority, and it was spent on ego, it was spent on protecting his reputation for as long as he could, rather than on building new homes. There we had the opportunity for the Tory party to take on the NIMBYs within it, the NIMBY MPs. Even if they lost a few, they had the scope. We could have built so many homes, lost opportunity because of politics. Theresa May, very busy with Brexit. David Cameron understood getting the deficit down mattered. And actually, I think people rewarded him with an election win because they looked at the rest of Europe. They looked at the world after the financial crisis, and they realized they could be a lot worse off. Did they feel better off? Not necessarily, but they knew it could be so much worse. And he won re-election. So when politicians make those tougher choices and do focus on the economy, I think it fundamentally does come down to the economy. But for every Tory MP, we can ask, why didn't you focus on the pro-growth agenda? There will be a very tragic political answer there that answers the question. Now, I think, I won't speak the rest of the panel. I'll guess that we would all say that's not good enough. But there will be a political answer there that solves the riddle.
Matthew, cheer us up.
I just want to sort of triply underline a point that's been made already, and that's about the term economic growth. So I think if you did a focus group of people and said, do you want more economic growth? It's, as somebody said, it's quite intangible as a concept. At the Labour Party conference next week in Liverpool, they'll be talking about how the Conservative Party have made you poorer. So I think people get things in terms of, has your household richer or poorer? And I think we need to think about how we talk about growth in terms of household income is probably more resonant with people than quite an abstract point about economic growth. Margaret Thatcher was very good at talking about economics in household terms. When she talked about inflation, for example, and she held up the two shopping baskets about what you could buy 1 year versus the next year. Again, a very simple way of explaining economic concepts to you that I think sometimes we can quite easily forget. But in terms of the bigger question about why we haven't got growth, I think partly politics is becoming very short-termist. And looking back, we are where we are, but looking back to right after the election, 2019, early 2020, what would a rational government have done with an 80 majority? They would have thought, right, we've got an 80 majority, that's at least 1 term in power, possibly 2 terms in power. Now's the time to make the tough decisions. Now the time to make the long-term decisions. So you see the growth, the households are getting better prosperity by the end of that parliament. I think politics is being very short-termist. I think one lesson from this is really how can you think more long-term, as this conference is all about.
Yeah, Liam, quickly, and then I'm going to come to the floor.
Sure. Just a quick point of information. UK growth has been sluggish, but it's worth pointing out that as of the latest revisions last Friday, if you go back to Q4 2019, which is the last quarter before lockdown, but also before Brexit was enacted in January 2020. So since Q4 2019, the UK has grown by 1.8%, nothing to write home about. But just to say, France during that period grew by 1.7%, and Germany grew by 0.2%. Now, the US outclassed all of us. The US during that period grew by 6.1%, not least because, as Aria has pointed out, their cheap energy, partly as a result of fracking. So it's worth pointing out, growth is low, but we don't seem to have suffered in terms of growth as a result of leaving the European Union. So let's make that clear.
Okay, I'm going to take a few comments from the floor. Maybe start on this side. So Andrew there, then the gentleman here on the aisle, then the gentleman at the front. Just rules of conduct here. Ideally a question. You are allowed a speech as long as it is 1 sentence long and ends in a question mark. And that way we'll get in as many people as possible. And if we could have these 3 gentlemen first. And if you also wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Andrew Allen, formerly of the Taxpayers Alliance. So, fantastic stuff, guys. Very thoughtful. My question is, do you think maybe it's psychology? As in all of the polling since 2019, the Ashcroft polls recently showing how many more people think the government needs to be solving our problems and how many more people think the government can't solve our problems. And psychologically, wouldn't it be better if we all thought we should be trying to solve our own problems? And doesn't that mean that perhaps us on the centre-right should be more positive and more optimistic? I'm sorry, I'm sticking my neck out a little bit. Can we, all right, so it's not all catastrophe. Things are better than they've ever been. Well, can 2 things be true at once? They could also be a lot better. But they are better than they've ever been, 1.8% richer than 2019. Can we be more positive? Would psychology be an answer? That's my question.
Okay, good question. Gentleman here on the aisle next. Again, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks very much. Glenn Bluff, I'm the chairman of Doncaster Conservative Federation. I'm going to take you back 12 months or so, if you don't mind. I hope that's not too painful. But we do very well in this country in the technology sector, in particular around financial services. We help with fintechs. We have a lot of freelancers in the industry promoting technology. But all of a sudden, they're now disappearing. 12 months ago, we said that the Conservative Party in the mini budget said we would get rid of IR35. It has now been in for 2 years. No one's talking about it anymore. And now we've got clients who are leaving the UK and going out to the rest of the world. What should we be doing about IR35?
Okay. And then I'll come to this gentleman in the front row, then I'll go over to this side for the next round. Sir, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, Howard Thompson, Chairman of Conservative Policy Forum in Surrey Heath. There was a book published quite recently called Planet Ponzi that looked at statistics in the United States between approximately 28 and now, and the proportion of gross profits that goes to Main Street manufacturing or whatever, things that actually do something and serve for you, and Wall Street, the bankers. And I forget the exact figures, but it's talking about a transition between 10% and 25 to 30% that goes to finance and financial situation. I was just wondering whether you have any comment to make on that, whether there's any relation to reality, and what the consequences of that have been in terms of what happens.
Andrew, Glenn and Howard, thank you very much for being so succinct. Let me just paraphrase some of those, and I'll start with you, Ted, on the end of the panel. Andrew says let's be a bit more upbeat. Kate, you started off by being pessimistic, and then the rest of the panel followed you. So let's have a bit more optimism. But I'm interested in this point about psychology as well. I mean, maybe it's just convenient for me, but I like to not believe opinion polls. And I have a theory that socialism is extremely popular in contemplation and extremely unpopular in application. And free market reform tends to be rather unpopular in contemplation, but hugely popular in application. I cannot think of a single Thatcher reform that was popular before it was actually executed, including the sale of council houses, by the way, which latterly was only shown to be a success. So maybe politicians of our ilk need actually to show a bit more bravery, because the initial baseline might look like the policy is unpopular, but if in effect it works, it becomes very popular afterwards. Glenn asked about IR35 and people moving away. And then, interestingly, if I can build on Howard's point, this GDP point. Matthew, you mentioned that, perhaps, growth isn't the right way to talk about things. Well, perhaps actually GDP isn't really the right way to talk about things. I mean, if you were to look at the Republic of Ireland, one reason its GDP is so high is there's just quite a lot of money in and out on major corporations. I'm sure it's to the benefit of the Republic of Ireland those corporations are there, but I don't know, maybe we should be measuring, average wages or median wages or some such like, rather than GDP as a whole. I'd welcome thoughts on that. Ted, let me start with you and then work along the panel, then we'll go to the other side.
I'm really tempted to agree with Andrew's sort of mentality point. And yeah, I mean, I like a bit of positivity. The panel has, as myself included, has not really exemplified it. But yeah, I mean, it's probably hard for the animal spirits to really get out of bed in the morning and go off and start a business if all you hear is relentless doom and gloom. But I'm a little bit sort of cautious about sort of mentality-based explanations, because I go back to the story that we were told about British relative decline in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, which was that it was some sort of product of, the establishment, and, the British mentality was unindustrial. Anyone remember the famous book, Decline of the English Industrial Spirit? Well, that was all nonsense. Turned out it was bad policies. It wasn't people's mentalities that were at fault. It was policy mistakes committed by specific British governments. And when they stopped making those mistakes and started having better policies, it turned out that people's mentalities improved, and it turned out that the English industrial spirit wasn't dead. So I always want to focus on policies, and then we can sort of talk about mentalities or views as a result of those. I'm going to pass on IR35. I think there are people in the panel who know a lot more about that than I do. Just quickly on the Planet Ponzi question. Look, if you create artificially an enormous amount of money in the system, as all of our countries have done through various QE processes, of course, a larger share of whatever gains or growth there is are going to go to institutions that manage money, because that's what you're prioritizing. I don't think blaming them, and I'm not saying you were, is the answer. That's a natural result of a bunch of policies that I think were completely mistaken and should be reversed and never followed again. But that's what you're going to get, is more financial engineering if that's what you prioritize as a government.
Aria.
I want to come back to something we were talking about earlier on polling, and I think it is possible to sneak policies around the electorate. I agree that the British public, if you ask them if they want to build more housing or if they want to have a better tax system, will probably say no, that will benefit people I don't like. But we have had successes with policies that basically do not say on the nose we're planning on building houses or we're planning on massively reforming business taxes. So I think full expensing, or the super deduction, as it was called during the pandemic, is a really good example of this. We have managed to make our business investment tax system, temporarily at the very least, much better, and people don't really understand how the policy works, and I think everyone feels a little bit richer as a result of that. I think we can do the same thing with housing. I think we might actually do the same thing with housing when we pass street votes, which on the face of it is just devolving more power down to the local level, but I think in actuality will enable a lot of people to get much wealthier by densifying their streets and selling off some of the houses that are built from doing that. So I don't think it necessarily matters that people don't really want what's good for them. So that'd be my first thought on that. On the finance question, I think it is probably a very good thing, actually, that we have the City of London here. For one, we can tax that money and use it for things that are useful and can help people. But on the other hand as well, the fact that we have so much finance here means it's easier to raise funding as a startup in the UK. It's easier. We have like the best payment system in the world, for example. Like, I think we pay way less per transaction, and also it's just like more convenient living your life. Like, if you go to America and you can't use contactless, in Germany you've got to pay for everything in cash. So I think there are major benefits to the fact that we have this. I would say there's probably one slight problem in that maybe the brightest people are incentivized to go into finance, which I think is a bit more zero sum compared to some other work. Like, maybe it'd be better if they'd be engineers or scientists. But I think that's realistically the only like big downside that I see from that.
Liam.
Sure. So on the psychology thing, I don't think you can crush the human spirit, and this country's got plenty of human spirit. So I think that's an issue. But to just go back to the media point, I agree with Kate that the kind of degrowth people, the sort of dog on a rope people, they've got a trust fund, they don't get much play. But what does get an awful lot of play, particularly on mainstream broadcasters, is that government spending is always good, and anyone that doesn't want more government spending is a Nazi. Mm-hmm. No mention is ever made of the massive debt interest bill, which I mentioned earlier, that's now second only to the NHS. You know, when the mainstream broadcasters cover business, they always talk to, idiot corporate politicians of big companies that don't actually do any business. They very rarely talk to SMEs. The SMEs that generate over half our GDP and 2/3 of our growth. So I do think there's a sort of part of the psychological problem and the bias against pro-growth policies is created by the mainstream media, particularly the broadcasters, I should say. On IR35, one reason the Treasury really hates Liz Truss isn't just because she put the wind up on when she was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, but also because she wants to scrap IR35, which the Treasury is possessed. It thinks it's a tax dodger's charter, which is complete nonsense. It's just a way that people with small firms don't have to spend every waking hour making ridiculously tiny tax payments that are completely counterproductive. So I think we should just scrap IR35. And on financial services, I'm a former asset manager myself. I've worked in financial services a lot, unusually for journalists perhaps. And I agree with a lot of what Aria said, but I just particularly on the draining of really smart people away from engineering and really productive things to pointless, often tax dodging, counterproductive financial engineering. But I'd just say this, as somebody who's worked in the City of London a lot and is very close to a lot of people in the City of London, it's all very well to have the biggest financial services sector of any major country in the world as a share of your GDP. And yeah, it does generate tax revenue. But if it behaves so badly that every 20 years it completely wrecks the economy, is it really all that good to have such a powerful City of London? We have not recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. And the 2008 financial crisis was largely the result of criminal, fraudulent activity by a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic and across the pond. So yeah, I'm all for financial services.
That's gone largely unpunished as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all for financial services, and I'm all for economic literacy, and I'm all for sophisticated payment systems and all the rest of it. But is the City of London really our friend and the economy's friend, given that once a generation, it wrecks the place?
Kate.
Thank you. Andrew, I agree with your optimism that it's pretty much the best time to be alive. It reminded me in 2020 for the Spectator's Christmas issue, our editor tends to run a piece every year, usually by a different author, to make the broad case that this is the best year to be alive. And in 2020, there was some discussion about whether or not that article would be going into the magazine. And indeed it did. I think it was written by Johan Norberg that year, who argued, no, 2020 is not the best year to be alive. But based on most metrics, it's the fourth best year to be alive. And it does put things into perspective, certainly. But I am an optimist on that front, but we are entering difficult times. We just told everybody worldwide virtually that the government can, when it wants to, step in and pay essentially every bill. It can pay your wages, it can pay your energy bills. I think we're entering into an increasingly authoritarian time where people do see the state as the answer because we've given them a lot of reason to. And I think that's going to take a lot of pushback. IR 35 is a disaster. Raising corporation tax, I think, was a very bad idea. I don't want it at 19%. I want it closer to 12. I want it to be competitive with the UK's neighbours. I think one of the biggest tragedies of what happened in those 49 days last year is that a lot of really good ideas were tossed out and won't be back for a generation. And a lot of really good free market, pro-growth ideas were tossed out because next to those ideas was a very, very big state spending package. I think it's really sad that those ideas are gone for a while now, and I have been arguing and will continue to argue that the former Prime Minister should take a little more responsibility for that.
Matthew.
On Andrew's psychology point, I think that the negative attitudes toward business in the UK has been a huge problem. And if you compare the UK to other countries, as you might expect, we're more negative about business than the United States is. Anybody comparing the business pages of the UK newspaper versus business pages of a US newspaper can see that straight away. We're actually even now more negative towards business and entrepreneurs than the French are, which may surprise people. And that's been fed in there by, I think the broadcasters are one aspect to it, but also universities, schools, a whole host of cultural issues as well. And that's led to that negative attitude. What does that then mean? Basically, when politicians are thinking about their, how do we sort of weigh things up, who should we tax more, who should tax less, it tends to be business that comes out first for tax rises.
We are right up against the clock, but I did promise I'd take a couple of comments from the sides of the gentleman there on the aisle and the gentleman there in the second row. If you can keep them very short, then I'll ask the panel either to respond or just for their closing thoughts. Sir.
I come from a business perspective, and a US-based business perspective, but I'm a proud British person who thinks multicultural Britain is a great thing. My challenge from a business perspective is having trust and confidence to invest. And thinking about where we are at the moment, the GDP of this region could be doubled by 2050 with an infrastructure project like HS2 that you mentioned. That's grand. We need to balance the short term and the long term, I fear. But from a business perspective, to invest in apprentices, in jobs, in training, in skills gap, we need something that balances jam tomorrow, but long term sustainable growth. How does the panel feel about how we balance that in an agenda that is driven by the electorate?
And the gentleman here in the second row.
Hello, I'm Michael Dangour, Leadership Group. Growth is a function of productivity, and productivity has stagnated over the last 10 years. I wonder what the panel believes are the causes of that and what we can do to put it right.
Okay, two easy ones to wrap up with. Let me go down the line the different way to last time. Matthew, I'll start with you. So, trust and confidence business needs. I must admit, I'm amazed now anybody invests in the energy sector because the rules change every 6 minutes. I mean, you're really investing in your ability to read political tea leaves, not in the ability to actually generate energy. And what explains the stagnation? Well, saying I think public sector productivity has gone backwards about 10%. I mean, backwards. You would have thought that pay rises should be associated with improved productivity, not diminishing productivity. But there you go. Closing thoughts, Matthew, Kate, Liam, Aria and Ted, and then I'll bring this panel to an end.
On the point about balance, I think you're right there. That basically politics is going increasingly short-term and focus on what's happening in the polls at any one time, rather than sort of longer-term perspectives, and we've seen that sort of live at the moment. I don't really know how you change that. I just hope that whoever's thinking about the next government, the people writing the manifestos for both the parties, after the next election, they're thinking more about the 5-year term of the Parliament rather than what happens in the following 12 months.
Thank you. Kate?
The business point's really interesting to me, and I have to say I'm torn, because on the one hand, I think it's outrageous that the circumstances change all the time, and I would love to see a world, especially in relation to the tax code, where it was understood amongst the major parties that business is a great thing in this country. It creates jobs. Corporation tax is a tax on workers, and ultimately you would get more investment into this country by companies knowing if they succeed here, they will profit from that. If there's a little fluctuation, fine, but they need to understand that success is equals profit. However, some of the response from businesses last week when Rishi Sunak watered down some of those targets, I found very interesting as well, because I think there has been a real gravy train when it comes to some of the UK's energy ambitions, and I think that this can apply to multiple sectors, where people knew that the technology was behind the more temporary targets, and companies thought, that's great, they're going to subsidize it. They're going to subsidize it for consumers to buy these boilers, they're going to heat pumps, they're going to subsidize it for them to buy these electric cars more than they already do, and I think it's actually quite right that some of that's been put to a stop. So ideally, you would get that consistency through the tax code and not through what has happened far too frequently, where promises are made between big business and big government, gets very crony very quickly, and usually the consumer suffers.
Liam?
So something I haven't mentioned that I'm very interested in is the use of planning gain. When land's given planning permission, we're an outlier in the UK that almost all that planning gain goes to land agents and landowners rather than to local authorities that's then used on infrastructure. If you use planning gain, it's the subject of my book, Home Truths, if you can use planning gain to really boost infrastructure investment and also use the cash it generates to unlock fraught local politics of planning, because you can build schools and hospitals, give people council tax rebates, and it changes the politics of planning. The gentleman there who mentioned infrastructure, look, there's so many things you could do, for instance, on our railway, quick fixes. I made a documentary about it 3 or 4 years ago for Channel 4 Dispatches. Just down the road, the Castlefield corridor, which all Mancunians know, the whole of the national rail network goes into one line in either direction over this narrow bridge at Deansgate. It buggers up trains all the way further up the northwest into Scotland. The Department of Transport's promised the money to broaden it 5 times in the last 20 years. It's never been delivered. There's so many, electrification of trains in the north. 80% of trains in the north of England aren't electric, they're diesel, which means they're slow and all the rest of it. And finally, just end where I started on the productivity point, you're completely right. Let's repeat the numbers. Up until 2007, for 30 years, productivity grew at 2% a year. Since then, it's grown at 0.2%. Why? It's because of skills, it's because of malinvestment, zombification of companies, because of QE, it's because of high tax. It's because for many of us, certainly for many in my business, growth and business are dirty words, and the people in this room need to work really, really hard to change those perceptions. Growth and business are the source of all revenue, all wealth, and all progress.
One word which I should put in as well, not on behalf of our donors, quite the opposite I have to say, is when we're talking about infrastructure, road matters as well as rail. We often think about rail. I think 9 times as many miles are covered by road in the UK as are covered by rail in terms of passenger journeys. Yeah. Aria?
Not to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to answer your productivity question. I think it's all housing. Not all housing, but we have like a major disincentive in the UK from moving from a lower paid job to a higher paid job. You would expect, like most Western countries, to expect people to move from low wage regions to higher wage regions. And we have this major, major disincentive from doing that, because if you earn like £30,000 in Newport, you are poorer than someone who earns £50,000 in Cambridge when you factor in your housing costs. So that's part of the reason why we have like such low productivity. People are not moving at the rate that we would expect from low productivity work to high productivity work. I think the other interesting thing about this is in most, and like a really good like piece of anecdata about how you can see that people aren't moving to where they would like to move is that in most Northern Hemisphere countries, the population has slowly migrated south because people have been wanting to go to warmer places. Even in Italy, where like the north is richer, the population is like has still moved south slightly. In the UK, this hasn't really happened because we are stopping people from moving south. Within that, we do also have lots of like little like disincentives in the tax code that also prevent people from moving from low productivity jobs to high productivity jobs. All over Twitter today, I've been seeing people talk about how if you have 3 children and you, I think, go from earning, I think about like 40k to 50k, but I'm not precisely sure on those numbers, you experience a 70% marginal tax rate. With like, you know, you can play around with those numbers a lot. It depends on how many children you have, what your spouse earns, etc., etc. But there are lots of parts of our tax code where there is a major disincentive from earning more money. So again, if your housing costs are going to go up, if your taxes are going to go up, if you're going to get all your childcare withdrawn, why would you move from a low productivity job to a high productivity job?
Ted, final word is yours.
I'm going to try on the productivity question as well. From a really long-term perspective, the UK has had productivity difficulties in terms of productivity growth off and on really since the late Victorian period. And economic historians have sort of wondered about this for ages. I don't think anyone's really answered the question, but there is certainly something that may be related to the city and the dominance of financial services here. But let me sort of suggest a couple of other factors. First, the UK is a very services-dominated economy. Measuring productivity growth in services is really tough. So the situation may be better than the numbers let on. Hard to know. The UK has a very big state sector. Mark's pointed out that productivity growth there is negative. If 40% of the people are going negative 10% backwards, the other 50 to 60% have to row twice as hard to even stay level, never mind sort of get ahead a little bit. Liam and others have talked about QE, zombie firms. I mentioned that myself. I think those are all important factors. One more thing. British business over the last 10, 20 years has relied very heavily on the import of low-wage, low-skilled labor. There are a lot of jobs that go unfilled in the UK, that's true, and they are filled with immigrant labor. Hey, look, I'm an immigrant myself a couple generations back. But it's in the long run, it's not a good thing economically to encourage business to substitute people for mechanization. Now, that is not a good thing overall in the long run. Immigration policy in the UK is incredibly complicated, but the UK has a really low rate of mechanization, and that has got to be part of the productivity question. So, and yeah, I'll end in one more word, housing.
We've overrun our time. Just before I thank our panel, our next panel in this room in about 8 minutes' time is on the topic, is the UK a safe space for free speech? And I'm delighted, if my eyes don't deceive me, that Graham Linehan, the author of Father Ted, has made it here for that panel. Initially banned by the Conservative Party for attending this conference until we appealed, by the way, and now allowed in. So I hope at least here's going to be a safe space for free speech. Thanks to all of our panel for kicking us off in such dynamic fashion. You be the judge of whether they've been appropriately optimistic or pessimistic. I won't be the judge of that, but please join me in giving a very warm thank you to Matthew, Kate, Liam, Aria, and Ted. Thank you all.
Good to meet you, Aria.